The wine glass shattered on the floor the moment Elena Marsh heard her mother say the words, "Nathan has asked for Grace's hand," and she said yes. For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard. She looked at Nathan Cole, the man she had loved quietly for 3 years, the man who had held her hand under the dinner table just 2 weeks ago, and promised her that spring would bring good news. He would not meet her eyes now. He stared at his plate as if the tablecloth held the answer to every question in the world. Grace, her younger sister, sat beside him with a triumphant smile stretched across her face. She reached for Nathan's hand and laced her fingers through his, right there at the family table, right in front of Elena, as if she had not spent the last 3 years watching Elena walk to that same house every Sunday to see him. "Say something, Elena," her mother, Margaret Marsh, said sharply. "Your sister is engaged. This is a happy day." Elena's throat felt tight, as if someone had wrapped a rope around it and pulled. She looked around the table. Her father kept his eyes on his food, unwilling to involve himself in anything that might upset his wife. Her younger brother shifted in his seat, sensing the tension but too young to understand its source, and Grace continued to smile, waiting for Elena's reaction the way a child waits to see if a trick has worked. "Congratulations," Elena finally managed to say. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. "Is that all?" Grace asked, tilting her head. There was something sharp hidden beneath her sweet tone, something that told Elena her sister knew exactly what she was doing and took pleasure in it. "What else would you like me to say?" Elena replied, keeping her voice steady even as her hands trembled beneath the table. Nathan finally looked up. For one brief second, something like guilt crossed his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the practiced calm of a man who had already made his choice and did not intend to defend it. "Elena, I hope you understand," he said carefully. "Grace and we found something real. I never meant to hurt you." Elena wanted to laugh. 3 years of stolen glances, of letters passed between them, of quiet promises whispered in the garden when no one else was near. None of that seemed to matter now. She had believed him when he said he was waiting for the right time to speak to her father. She had believed him when he said he loved her. And now he sat across from her, holding her sister's hand, calling what they built together nothing at all. "I understand perfectly," Elena said and rose from the table. "Sit down," Margaret snapped. "You will not embarrass this family tonight." "I am not embarrassing anyone, Mother. I simply have no appetite." Elena's voice remained calm, though inside she felt as though the floor had opened beneath her feet. She walked out of the dining room and up the narrow staircase to her bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind her, she could hear her mother apologizing to Nathan's family for her dramatic daughter, as if Elena's pain was an inconvenience rather than a wound freshly cut. Once inside her room, Elena closed the door and pressed her back against it, sliding down until she sat on the floor. She did not cry. She had cried enough over the past weeks, sensing that something had shifted between her and Nathan but refusing to believe her own instincts. Now there was nothing left to cry about, only the cold, quiet understanding that the man she loved had chosen her sister and that her family expected her to smile through it. She thought of every moment that had led to this. The first time she met Nathan at a neighbor's garden party, when he had complimented the book she was reading and asked to borrow it when she finished. The letters they exchanged in secret, because Nathan said he wanted to court her properly once he had saved enough to speak with her father with confidence. The evening he kissed her hand in the orchard and told her that no one else in the world understood him the way she did. She had believed every word. But somewhere between those quiet promises, Grace had noticed. Grace, who had never wanted for anything, who had always taken what she pleased without a thought for who might be left behind. Grace had turned her attention to Nathan, and within months, he had forgotten every promise he made to Elena. There was a knock at her door. Elena wiped her face, though there were no tears to wipe, and opened it to find her father standing there, looking uncomfortable in the way he always did when emotion entered a room. "Your mother wants you to come back down," he said. "The Cole family is asking about you." "Tell them I am unwell," Elena said. Her father hesitated, then nodded and left without another word. He had never been the sort of man to fight for anyone, least of all his eldest daughter, who had learned early in life that comfort in this house came only to those who caused the least trouble. Elena sat by her window that night, looking out over the dark garden where she and Nathan once walked together. She thought about leaving the house entirely, packing a bag and disappearing to some distant town where no one knew her name or her story. But she had nowhere to go, no money of her own, and no one who would take her in without questions. So instead, she decided she would stay. She would attend the wedding when it came. She would smile when required, and stand quietly in corners when she was not. She would let her family believe that her heart had mended, because giving them the satisfaction of seeing her break would be a defeat she refused to hand them. 3 weeks passed in this manner. Elena helped with wedding preparations because her mother demanded it, choosing flowers she did not care for, and fitting gowns she would never wear herself. Grace seemed to delight in involving her sister in every detail, asking her opinion on table settings and guest lists, as though nothing unusual had happened between them. Elena wondered if her sister truly believed there was nothing wrong in what she had done, or if this was simply another way to remind Elena of what she had lost. One afternoon, while arranging flowers for a dress fitting, Grace turned to her with an expression Elena had come to recognize well, a look that pretended concern while searching for weakness. "You are not still upset, are you?" Grace asked. "It has been weeks." "I am fine," Elena said, focusing on the flowers in her hands. "Good, because Nathan says you have been cold toward him. He worries it will affect the wedding." Elena set down the flowers and looked directly at her sister. "Tell Nathan he need not worry about anything from me." Grace studied her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether there was a hidden meaning in the words. Then she smiled, satisfied, and returned to arranging the table settings as if the conversation had never happened. That evening, needing air that did not carry the scent of wedding flowers or her mother's disapproval, Elena decided to attend a small countryside gathering hosted by a family friend, one she had been invited to weeks earlier and had planned to decline. Now, desperate for any escape from her own house, she changed into a simple gray dress and asked the carriage driver to take her there before she could change her mind. The gathering was smaller than she expected, held in a modest hall, lit with warm candles, and filled with unfamiliar faces from families she barely knew. Elena found a quiet corner near the windows, content to watch rather than participate, when she noticed a man standing near the far wall who seemed equally uninterested in the conversations around him. He was tall, dressed in fine but understated clothing that spoke of wealth without announcing it loudly. His expression was thoughtful, almost distant, as though his mind occupied a place far from the noise of the room. Elena did not know who he was, and in that moment, she found she did not care to know. It was refreshing to stand near someone who expected nothing from her, who did not know her name or her story, who could not judge her for the wounds she carried. She had no way of knowing that the quiet stranger across the room had already noticed her too, and that this small, unplanned evening would change the course of everything that followed. For a while, Elena simply watched the room. Couples danced near the center of the hall, their laughter rising above the soft music played by a small group of musicians in the corner. She recognized a few faces from town, families her mother often spoke of with envy or admiration, but she made no effort to approach anyone. She preferred the quiet of her corner, the space where no one expected her to smile or explain why she had come alone. A servant passed by with a tray of drinks, and Elena took one simply to have something to hold. She sipped slowly, letting her eyes wander across the room again, and found that the tall stranger near the far wall had shifted his position slightly, though he still seemed to keep his distance from the crowd. There was something in his posture that reminded her of herself, someone standing among people yet remaining entirely apart from them. She thought of Nathan then, unwillingly, the way his laugh used to fill a room and how he had always found her first at any gathering, weaving through guests just to stand beside her. She pushed the memory away before it could take hold. Tonight was not for thinking of him. Tonight was for forgetting, even if only for a few hours. A young woman named Charlotte, a distant acquaintance of the family hosting the gathering, approached Elena with a friendly smile. "You look as though you'd rather be anywhere else," Charlotte said kindly, taking a seat beside her. Elena managed a small laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who feels the same way most evenings," Charlotte replied. "These gatherings can feel rather hollow, don't you think? Everyone's smiling, no one saying anything real." "I suppose that's true," Elena said, grateful for the honesty in the stranger's words. It was a relief to speak with someone who did not know her history, who saw only a quiet woman in a gray dress, rather than the sister who had been left behind. They spoke for a while about small, unimportant things, the weather turning colder, a book Charlotte had recently finished, the quality of the music. It was the first conversation Elena had enjoyed in weeks, free of hidden meanings or careful words chosen to avoid upsetting her mother. When Charlotte excused herself to greet another guest, Elena found herself smiling faintly, the first real smile she had allowed herself since the night of the engagement announcement. She noticed the tall stranger again a short while later, this time closer, though he had not approached her directly. He stood near a window not far from where she sat, looking out at the darkened garden beyond the glass. There was a stillness about him that intrigued her, a sense that he carried his own private thoughts the way she carried hers. As the evening wore on, Elena rose to find a quieter spot near the terrace doors, needing a moment away from the noise of the hall. The night air outside was cool and carried the scent of late autumn leaves. She stepped just beyond the doors, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and allowed herself a long, slow breath. For the first time in weeks, she did not think of Nathan or Grace or the wedding that awaited her in the coming months. She thought only of the quiet dark before her, the stars beginning to appear above the garden, and the strange, unfamiliar peace of standing somewhere no one expected anything of her. She did not yet know that the man from across the hall had followed the same instinct that drew her outside, and that in a few moments, their paths would cross in a way neither of them anticipated. But for now she stood alone beneath the darkening sky, breathing freely for what felt like the first time in a very long while, unaware that the worst chapter of her life had already ended, and something entirely new was about to begin. The terrace door creaked softly as Elena stepped further into the garden, the cold air biting gently at her skin. She had not expected anyone else to be outside at this hour, so when a low voice spoke from somewhere near the stone railing, she startled and turned quickly. "Forgive me. I did not mean to frighten you." The tall stranger from the hall stood a short distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression apologetic. Up close, Elena noticed his eyes first, dark, steady, and unusually calm for a man attending a gathering full of noise and false laughter. "You didn't frighten me," Elena said, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. "I simply wasn't expecting company." "Neither was I," he admitted, "until I saw you slip outside. I confess I felt the same need to escape the noise." There was something disarming about his honesty. Most men she had known offered polished words meant to impress rather than reveal anything true about themselves. This man spoke as though sincerity cost him nothing. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Elena said. "I'm Elena Marsh." "Julian Ashford," he replied, giving a small bow of his head. The name meant little to her at first, though something in his manner, the quiet confidence, the fine tailoring of his coat, the way others in the hall had given him space without seeming to notice they were doing it, suggested he was a man of some importance. She decided not to ask further. Tonight, she preferred to be simply Elena, not the eldest daughter of the Marsh family, not the woman whose heart had been quietly broken weeks before. "You seem to prefer the garden to the ballroom," Julian observed, stepping closer to the railing beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. "I find gardens ask less of me," Elena said. "No one expects me to dance or laugh at the right moments." Julian was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's a rather guarded way to spend an evening." "Perhaps I have reason to be guarded," Elena replied, surprising herself with her own honesty. She had not intended to say so much to a stranger, but something about the darkness and the quiet made the words come easier. "I won't pry," Julian said gently. "Though I will say, whatever reason you have, it hasn't dimmed you. You carried yourself through that hall as though none of it touched you." Elena looked at him, startled by how closely he had been watching her without her noticing. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," he said simply. "It's something of a habit." They stood together for a while, exchanging small observations about the gathering, the families in attendance, the music drifting faintly from inside. Elena found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she had not expected. There was no pressure in his conversation, no hidden agenda she needed to guard against. He asked nothing of her that she was unwilling to give, and in turn, she found herself curious about him, though she kept her questions simple. "Do you often attend gatherings like this?" she asked. "Rarely," Julian admitted. "My brother insisted I come tonight. He believes I spend too much time alone with my correspondence, and not enough time among people." "And do you agree with him?" "Sometimes," Julian said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "Tonight, I find myself glad I came." Elena felt warmth rise to her cheeks and was grateful for the darkness that hid it. She had not expected to feel anything close to pleasure this evening, not after the weeks she had endured, yet here she stood, speaking with a stranger beneath the stars, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the terrace door opening again. A younger man stepped out, his features similar enough to Julian's that Elena guessed immediately he must be the brother Julian had mentioned. "There you are," the younger man said, his tone teasing. "I thought you'd disappeared entirely." "I needed air," Julian said simply. The younger man's eyes moved to Elena with open curiosity. "And found excellent company, it seems. I don't believe we've met. Henry Ashford." "Elena Marsh," she replied, offering a polite nod. Something flickered across Henry's expression at the mention of her name, though he said nothing about it directly. Elena wondered, briefly, if he recognized her family name from town gossip, though she pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter tonight. Nothing from her old life needed to follow her into this quiet garden. "Well, I won't interrupt further," Henry said, though his smile suggested he found the entire situation rather amusing. "I only came to say the carriages are being called soon, for those of us with an early morning ahead." Elena realized with mild disappointment that the evening was drawing to a close. She had lost track of time entirely, something that rarely happened to her, especially in recent weeks when every hour seemed to drag under the weight of her thoughts. "I should return inside," she said. "My family will wonder where I've gone." "Of course," Julian said, though something in his voice suggested reluctance to see her leave. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Marsh." "The pleasure was mine," Elena replied, and found she meant it entirely. As she turned to walk back toward the hall, Julian spoke once more. "I hope our paths cross again." Elena paused, glancing back at him. Perhaps they will. She did not know, as she walked back into the noise and light of the hall, that Julian watched her the entire way, or that Henry leaned toward his brother once she was out of earshot. "Marsh," Henry said thoughtfully. "I know that name. Isn't there a wedding happening in that family soon? The younger daughter, I believe." Julian's expression shifted slightly. "What do you know of it?" "Only what the town has been discussing," Henry said. "The younger sister is marrying a man named Nathan Cole. Apparently there was some scandal involving the elder sister, something about broken promises." Julian said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the terrace doors through which Elena had disappeared. The following days passed slowly for Elena, filled once again with wedding preparations she had no desire to attend to. Grace seemed more demanding than ever, insisting Elena accompany her to fittings and flower selections as though her presence brought some sort of validation to the entire affair. Margaret, meanwhile, continued to praise Grace's choice at every opportunity, seemingly unaware or unwilling to acknowledge how each comment landed like a small blow against her eldest daughter. Elena found herself thinking often of the quiet garden and the stranger she had met there. She told no one of the encounter, keeping it as a private comfort she could return to in her mind whenever the weight of her family's expectations grew too heavy. She wondered if Julian Ashford had meant what he said about their paths crossing again, or if it had simply been a kind thing to say to a woman standing alone in the dark. She received her answer sooner than she expected. 10 days after the gathering, a letter arrived at the Marsh household addressed specifically to Elena. Her mother eyed the envelope with open curiosity as she handed it over, clearly wishing to know its contents but restraining herself enough not to ask outright. Elena waited until she was alone in her room before opening it. The handwriting was neat and controlled, each letter formed with quiet precision. "Miss Marsh, I hope this letter finds you well. I have thought often of our conversation in the garden and find myself hoping we might speak again, under less crowded circumstances. My brother mentions there is to be a small gathering at the Whitmore estate next week, and I would be glad of your company there, should you be willing to attend. Yours sincerely, Julian Ashford." Elena read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for any hidden meaning behind the simple words. There was nothing demanding in his tone, nothing that suggested he expected anything of her beyond her presence. It was, she realized, the opposite of everything she had experienced with Nathan. No secrecy, no whispered promises meant only for private ears. Simply an honest invitation extended in the open. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, deciding she would respond that evening. For the first time since the night of Grace's engagement, Elena felt something other than grief settle in her chest. It was small, fragile, and entirely unfamiliar, but it was there nonetheless. A quiet, cautious hope that perhaps her story was not yet finished, that somewhere beyond the pain her family had caused her, something new might be waiting to unfold. That evening, Elena sat at her writing desk long after the household had gone quiet, composing and discarding several drafts of her reply, before settling on words that felt honest without revealing too much of the hope stirring inside her. "Mr. Ashford, thank you for your kind letter. I would be glad to attend the gathering at the Whitmore estate. I look forward to continuing our conversation. Elena Marsh." She read it over several times, wondering if it sounded too eager or too distant, before finally deciding it struck the right balance. She sealed the letter and left it on the hall table to be sent the following morning, then lay awake for some time afterward, staring at the ceiling and turning over every word Julian had spoken to her in the garden. The days leading up to the Whitmore gathering passed in a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Dread, because Grace's wedding preparations continued to consume the household, each day bringing some new demand from her mother or her sister that pulled Elena further into a role she had no desire to play. Anticipation. Because somewhere beneath the exhaustion of pretending everything was well, she found herself counting the days until she might see Julian again. She said nothing to her family about the letter or the invitation. She had learned, over the years, that anything precious to her became a target the moment her mother or Grace discovered it. Better to keep this small, hopeful thing to herself until she understood what it truly meant. 2 days before the gathering, Elena found herself alone in the garden behind the family estate, seeking a moment's peace from the noise inside. She sat on the old stone bench beneath the apple tree, a spot that had once been her favorite place to read as a child, before life had grown so complicated. "You've been quiet lately," a voice said, and Elena looked up to find her father standing nearby, an unusual softness in his expression. "I've had a great deal to think about," she replied carefully. Her father sat beside her, an action so uncommon that Elena immediately understood something must be troubling him. He was not a man given to seeking out conversation, especially conversation that touched on matters of the heart. "Your mother believes you've recovered from the situation with Nathan," he said, choosing his words with visible care. "I confess I am less certain." Elena studied her father's face, searching for the meaning behind his words. "Are you asking if I'm well, or asking me to reassure you that I am, so you needn't worry?" He gave a small, tired laugh. "Perhaps both. I know I have not always defended you the way I should have. Your mother's opinions tend to fill every room she enters, and I have grown accustomed to letting them stand rather than offering my own." "You needn't apologize," Elena said, though something in her softened at his admission. "I do, though," he continued. "You deserved better than to watch your sister take what was meant for you, and be told to smile through it. I should have said something that night. I should say something now." Elena reached over and took her father's hand, a rare gesture of closeness between them. "Thank you for saying it now, at least." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn air cool around them, until her father finally spoke again. "Is there something new giving you hope? You seem different these past few days. Lighter, somehow." Elena hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "I met someone at the gathering a few weeks ago. I don't know what will come of it, but it has given me something to think about besides the wedding." Her father studied her carefully, then nodded, seeming satisfied without needing further detail. "Then I hope, whatever it is, it brings you the happiness you deserve." It was the kindest thing he had said to her in years, and Elena found herself blinking back unexpected tears as he rose and returned to the house, leaving her alone once more with her thoughts and the quiet rustle of leaves above her head. The day of the Whitmore gathering arrived with a crispness in the air that suggested winter was not far behind. Elena dressed carefully, choosing a deep blue gown that had once been her favorite before the weight of recent months made her forget such things mattered. She arranged her hair simply, refusing the elaborate styles her mother favored for such occasions, and left the house before Margaret could offer any unwanted opinions about her appearance. The Whitmore estate was grander than the hall where she had first met Julian, its gardens meticulously kept even in the fading autumn light. Elena felt a flutter of nerves as she entered, scanning the growing crowd of guests for a familiar face, uncertain whether Julian would truly be there, or whether the letter had simply been a passing kindness, easily forgotten once written. She found him near the entrance to the main hall, speaking with an older gentleman she did not recognize. When his eyes found hers across the room, something in his expression shifted, a warmth entering his gaze that made Elena's heart quicken despite her attempts to remain composed. He excused himself from his conversation and crossed the room toward her. "Miss Marsh, I wasn't certain you would come." "You invited me," Elena said, offering a small smile. "It would have been rude to decline." "I'm glad manners won out," Julian replied, and there was a teasing lightness in his voice that Elena found herself enjoying immensely. They spent much of the evening in each other's company, wandering between conversations with other guests but always finding their way back to one another. Julian asked thoughtful questions about her interests, her opinions on the books she read, the places she hoped to visit one day, and Elena found herself speaking more freely than she had with anyone in years. There was no need to guard her words with him, no fear that anything she said might later be used against her by a sister eager for advantage, or a mother quick to judge. As the evening drew to a close, Julian walked her to her waiting carriage, the two of them lingering in the cool night air longer than was strictly necessary. "I would like to see you again, Elena," Julian said, using her given name for the first time. "If you are willing." "I am willing," she replied softly, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a very long while. She did not yet know how much that hope would be tested in the weeks ahead, nor how deeply her sister's jealousy would reach once Grace learned of the Duke's growing interest in the sister she had always believed to be beneath her. The wedding was 3 days away, and the Marsh household had become a storm of ribbons, flowers, and raised voices. Elena moved through it all like a ghost, present but untouched, her mind constantly drifting to the last letter she had received from Julian, tucked safely inside her writing desk alongside 3 others that had arrived over the past weeks. "Elena, the seamstress needs you for the final fitting," Grace called from the hallway, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she wanted something done immediately. Elena set down the book she had been pretending to read and made her way to Grace's room, where the local seamstress, a patient woman named Margaret Wells, no relation to Elena's mother despite the shared name, stood surrounded by fabric and pins. "You look tired," Grace observed as Elena entered, studying her sister with the sharp attentiveness she usually reserved for judging others. "Have you not been sleeping well?" "I've been sleeping fine," Elena said, taking her place near the mirror as instructed. "You seem different lately," Grace continued, her eyes narrowing slightly, almost happy. "It's strange given everything." Elena kept her expression neutral, refusing to give her sister the satisfaction of any reaction. "I don't see why my happiness should concern you." Grace's mouth tightened briefly before smoothing back into its usual pleasant mask. "It doesn't concern me. I only find it curious." The fitting continued in tense silence, broken only by Margaret Wells's occasional instructions about fabric and measurements. Elena focused on breathing steadily, on keeping her thoughts anchored to Julian's last letter rather than the suffocating atmosphere of the room, in which he had written of his hope to see her again soon, perhaps at a small dinner his family intended to host before the season ended. That evening, as Elena helped fold table linens in the drawing room, her mother entered with an expression of barely contained excitement. "You'll never guess who has expressed interest in attending Grace's wedding," Margaret announced, settling into her favorite chair with obvious satisfaction. "Duke Julian Ashford. Apparently he and his brother received an invitation through the Whitmore family and have accepted." Elena's hands stilled over the linens for the briefest moment before she forced herself to continue folding. "A duke, attending Grace's wedding? Can you imagine the honor?" Margaret continued, oblivious to the way Elena's breath had caught in her throat. "The Ashford family rarely attends weddings outside their own circle. This will be the talk of the entire county." Elena said nothing, though her mind raced with questions. She had known Julian and Henry were friends of the Whitmore family, but she had not considered that this connection might bring them directly into her sister's wedding celebration, into the very event she had been dreading for weeks. "Grace will be thrilled," Margaret added, rising from her chair. "A duke's presence will elevate the entire affair." Once her mother left the room, Elena sat down heavily on the settee, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She would see Julian again, but not in the quiet, private settings they had grown accustomed to. She would see him surrounded by her family, in the very place where Nathan and Grace would be celebrated as the happy couple, where Elena herself would be expected to smile and play the role of supportive sister despite everything she carried inside. She wondered if Julian knew the significance of the wedding he was about to attend, if he understood that the bride was the sister of the woman he had been courting these past weeks. She resolved to write to him that evening, to explain the situation before he arrived, and was caught unaware. Her letter was brief, honest, and difficult to write. "Julian, I have just learned that you and your brother intend to attend my sister's wedding this week. I feel I must tell you, in case you were unaware, that the groom is a man I once cared for deeply, before circumstances led him to my sister instead. I do not say this to trouble you, only so that you are not caught by surprise should the atmosphere feel strange to you. I understand if this changes anything about your plans. Elena." She sent the letter that same night, uncertain what response she might receive, if any. Julian's reply arrived the following morning, delivered by a servant who seemed faintly amused by the frequency of correspondence flowing between the Marsh and Ashford households. "Elena, thank you for telling me. It changes nothing about my intention to attend, except perhaps to make me more determined to stand beside you should the day prove difficult. You need not carry this alone. Julian." Elena read the letter 3 times, each time feeling the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly. She folded it carefully and placed it with the others, drawing strength from the knowledge that she would not face the wedding entirely without support. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and bright, the kind of clear autumn day that made the countryside look almost too beautiful for the occasion Elena dreaded. The Marsh household buzzed with activity from dawn, servants rushing between rooms, flowers being arranged in the entrance hall, and Grace's voice rising periodically in demands that grew increasingly frantic as the hour approached. Elena dressed in a pale green gown her mother had selected for her, one that complemented Grace's wedding colors without drawing attention away from the bride. She stood before her mirror for a long moment, studying her reflection, searching for some sign of the pain she carried beneath the composed exterior she had practiced for weeks. "You look lovely," her father said from the doorway, startling her from her thoughts, "though I imagine that offers little comfort today." "I'll manage," Elena said, offering him a small, grateful smile. The ceremony took place in the local chapel, filled with flowers and candlelight despite the daylight hour. Elena took her position near the front, close enough to see every detail of the exchange between Nathan and Grace, close enough to hear every promise he made to her sister that echoed the very words he had once whispered to Elena in the privacy of the garden. She kept her expression carefully neutral throughout the ceremony, focusing on breathing steadily, on the quiet reminder that somewhere in the gathered guests, Julian sat watching, aware of exactly what this moment cost her. She did not look for him directly, unwilling to risk her composure by meeting his eyes too soon, but the knowledge of his presence steadied her more than she expected. When the ceremony concluded and the guests moved toward the reception hall for the celebration that followed, Elena found herself swept into a receiving line, offering congratulations to Nathan and Grace, alongside dozens of other guests. Nathan's eyes met hers briefly as she approached, something unreadable flickering across his features. "Elena," he said quietly, taking her offered hand, "thank you for being here." "Of course," she replied evenly. "I wish you both happiness." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, but Nathan seemed to accept them at face value, releasing her hand as she moved on to embrace Grace, who received the gesture with a satisfied smile that made Elena's stomach tighten. "You did wonderfully," Grace whispered as they embraced, her tone carrying an edge Elena recognized well. "I was worried you might make a scene." "I would never embarrass you on your wedding day," Elena replied, keeping her voice light despite the sting of the comment. She moved through the reception in a careful performance of composure, accepting compliments on the flowers she had helped arrange, engaging in small talk with relatives she barely knew, all while searching the crowded hall for a glimpse of Julian, without appearing to search at all. She found him eventually, standing near the edge of the dance floor with Henry, both men dressed impeccably for the occasion. Julian's eyes found hers almost immediately, as though he had been watching for her arrival the entire time. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward her, weaving through the crowd with quiet purpose. "You look as though you're holding yourself together through sheer will," he said softly when he reached her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Is it that obvious?" Elena asked, echoing the question she had once asked him in the garden. "Only to someone who has been watching closely," Julian replied, a faint smile touching his mouth despite the seriousness in his eyes. "Would you care to dance? It might offer a moment's distraction, if nothing else." Elena hesitated only briefly before accepting his offered hand, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor as the musicians began a slow, gentle melody. She was acutely aware of eyes turning toward them, whispers beginning to circulate among the guests as they recognized the Duke dancing with the bride's elder sister. "People are staring," Elena murmured as they moved through the steps of the dance. "Let them," Julian said simply. "You've spent this entire day performing for everyone else's comfort. Allow yourself this one dance for your own." Something in his words loosened the tightness that had gripped Elena's chest since the morning began. For the length of the dance, she allowed herself to forget the ceremony, the receiving line, her sister's satisfied smile, and simply existed in the moment, guided by Julian's steady presence. Across the room, Grace watched the dance with narrowed eyes, her earlier satisfaction curdling into something sharper as she registered the attention her sister was receiving from a man of Julian's standing. She turned to Nathan, who stood beside her accepting congratulations from a stream of guests, and touched his arm. "Did you know the Duke was courting Elena?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying an edge Nathan recognized from years of knowing her. Nathan followed her gaze to the dance floor, his expression unreadable as he watched Elena move gracefully in Julian's arms, a genuine smile on her face that he had not seen directed at anyone in months, certainly never at him during their own courtship's final weeks. "I had heard rumors," he admitted carefully. "This is meant to be my day," Grace said, her voice tightening, "not an opportunity for her to parade around with a duke." "She's not parading," Nathan said, surprising himself with the mild defense. "She's simply dancing." Grace shot him a sharp look but said nothing further, turning her attention back to the guests still waiting to offer their congratulations, though her earlier joy had noticeably dimmed. When the dance concluded, Julian escorted Elena from the floor, his hand resting lightly at her back in a gesture that felt both protective and respectful. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. "I know today has not been easy for you." "You made it easier," Elena admitted, meeting his eyes directly for the first time that day. "I intend to keep doing so," Julian replied, "for as long as you'll allow me to." The rest of the reception passed in a blur of conversation and forced smiles, but Elena found herself returning again and again to the memory of that dance, the steady warmth of Julian's hand, the quiet reassurance in his voice. As the celebration finally began to wind down and guests started their departures, Julian found her once more near the entrance hall, where she had stepped away briefly to collect her thoughts. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, his tone more serious than it had been throughout the evening. "Not simply through letters, but with your father's knowledge and consent, if you would permit it." Elena's heart raced at the implication behind his words. "You wish to court me openly?" "I have wished it since the night we met in that garden," Julian said. "I only waited because I did not want to complicate matters further while your family navigated the wedding, but I find I can wait no longer to make my intentions known." Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of uncertainty, and found none. "Then yes," she said softly, "I would welcome that." Julian's expression softened into something close to relief, and for a moment, standing in the entrance hall while the last remnants of her sister's wedding celebration continued behind them, Elena allowed herself to believe that perhaps her own happiness had not been buried alongside the promises Nathan had broken, but was only now beginning to bloom, quietly and unexpectedly, in the presence of a man who had chosen her without hesitation or condition. Before Julian departed that evening, he found a quiet moment to speak with Elena's father, who stood near the carriage yard overseeing the departure of guests. Elena watched from a distance, her heart pounding as she saw the two men exchange words she could not hear. Julian's posture respectful, her father's expression shifting from surprise to something like cautious approval. "What did he say to you?" Elena asked once Julian had departed and her father approached her. "He asked permission to call on you properly," her father said, a note of wonder in his voice he did not bother to hide. "A duke, asking my permission, as though I were a man of any real consequence." "You are my father," Elena said. "Of course your permission matters." Her father studied her for a long moment. "He seems sincere, Elena, more sincere than I expected from a man of his standing. I told him he was welcome to call, provided his intentions remained honorable." "And what did he say to that?" "That he intended nothing less," her father replied, and Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at the memory of Julian's steady voice, his unwavering certainty. The following morning, as the household slowly recovered from the wedding's exhaustion, Grace sought Elena out in the garden, where she had retreated for a moment of solitude before the day's chores resumed. "You danced with a duke at my wedding," Grace said without preamble, her arms crossed as she approached. "He asked, and I accepted," Elena replied evenly. "I don't see the harm in it." "The harm," Grace said, her voice rising slightly, "is that yesterday was meant to be about me, about my marriage. Not about you finding some new attachment to flaunt in front of everyone." "I flaunted nothing," Elena said, though she felt her patience thinning. "I danced once, at your husband's celebration, with a man who has shown me genuine kindness. I fail to see how that diminishes your day." Grace's expression flickered with something Elena couldn't quite name, perhaps jealousy, perhaps the uncomfortable recognition that her sister's fortunes might soon eclipse her own. "Just be careful, Elena. Men like that rarely stay interested in women like us for long." "Women like us?" Elena repeated, an edge entering her voice for the first time. "You mean women without titles or fortunes? Perhaps you're speaking from experience with Nathan, wondering if his interest will fade now that the excitement of the wedding has passed." Grace's face flushed with anger. "That's unfair." "Is it?" Elena asked quietly. "You spent 3 years watching me build something with Nathan before deciding you wanted it for yourself. Forgive me if I don't take your concern for my happiness entirely at face value." The sisters stood in tense silence for a long moment before Grace turned and walked back toward the house without another word, her shoulders stiff with barely controlled anger. Elena remained in the garden, her heart still racing from the confrontation, wondering if she had said too much or simply spoken the truth that had been building inside her for weeks. She thought of Julian's promise to call on her properly, of the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke of his intentions, and found herself hoping fiercely that this new chapter of her life might finally be one where she was chosen first, rather than left standing in someone else's shadow. The days following the wedding brought a strange new rhythm to the Marsh household. Grace, now married and preparing to move into Nathan's family home nearby, seemed less present in the daily routines Elena had grown accustomed to, though her sharp comments and pointed observations continued whenever their paths crossed. Margaret, meanwhile, had shifted her attention entirely toward the possibility of a duke's interest in her eldest daughter, her earlier dismissiveness toward Elena transforming almost overnight into eager attentiveness that felt as unfamiliar as it did unwelcome. "You must wear the blue gown when he calls," Margaret instructed one afternoon, fussing over Elena's appearance with a thoroughness she had never before applied to her eldest daughter. "And do try to appear more delicate. Men of his standing prefer softness in a woman." "I'll be myself, Mother," Elena said firmly, though she allowed her mother to adjust the collar of her dress without further protest, choosing her battles carefully in this strange new landscape of parental attention. She did not yet know how fiercely Grace would fight against this new happiness, unwilling to watch her overlooked sister rise to a status greater than her own. Julian's carriage arrived at the Marsh estate precisely at the hour he had promised, a detail Elena noticed immediately and appreciated. Nathan had always been careless with time, arriving late to their meetings with easy apologies that Elena had once found endearing but now recognized as a small sign of the carelessness that would later define his treatment of her. "He's here," Margaret announced unnecessarily from the window, her voice pitched with excitement she made no effort to hide. "Elena, come away from that book and greet him properly." Elena set aside the novel she had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour and smoothed the front of her dress, taking a steadying breath before making her way to the entrance hall. Through the window, she watched Julian step down from his carriage, dressed simply but elegantly, carrying himself with the same quiet confidence she remembered from their first meeting in the garden. Her father greeted him at the door, the two men exchanging brief pleasantries before Julian was shown into the drawing room, where Elena waited with her mother hovering nearby, unable to disguise her eagerness to observe every moment of the visit. "Miss Marsh," Julian said, offering a small bow as he entered, his eyes finding hers immediately despite the presence of her parents in the room. "Mr. Ashford," Elena replied, using the more formal address out of habit, though something in his expression suggested he preferred otherwise. "Please, sit," Margaret urged, gesturing toward the chairs arranged near the window with obvious excitement. "May I offer you tea? Something stronger, perhaps?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you," Julian said politely, taking the seat offered to him while Elena settled into the chair across from him, acutely aware of her mother's presence lingering nearby, clearly unwilling to leave the room despite the awkwardness of her hovering. The conversation began stiffly, weighed down by Margaret's frequent interjections and her father's watchful silence, but gradually settled into something more natural, as Julian asked Elena about her interests, her thoughts on recent events in town, careful questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "I understand you enjoy reading," Julian said, glancing toward the novel Elena had left on the side table. "What has captured your attention lately?" "A collection of essays, mostly," Elena admitted, "though I confess I've struggled to focus on much of anything these past weeks." "Understandable," Julian said, his tone gentle enough that Elena knew he understood the reference without her needing to explain further. Margaret, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward eagerly. "Elena has always been a thoughtful girl, though perhaps too serious for her own good. Grace, my younger daughter, has always been the more lively one, though of course she's recently married and settled into her own household now. I found Miss Marsh's thoughtfulness quite refreshing when we met," Julian said evenly, a subtle firmness in his tone that made Margaret's smile falter slightly. The visit continued for nearly an hour, Julian's patience with Margaret's frequent interruptions never wavering, though Elena noticed the way his attention always returned to her the moment an opening presented itself. When he finally rose to take his leave, he requested a brief moment alone with Elena in the garden, a request Margaret reluctantly granted after a pointed look from her husband. Once outside, away from her mother's watchful presence, Elena felt herself relax in a way she hadn't managed throughout the entire formal visit. "I apologize for my mother," she said, a rueful smile touching her lips. "She's rather enthusiastic about your visit." "There's nothing to apologize for," Julian said, though his own smile suggested he had noticed Margaret's eagerness clearly enough. "I understand the impulse. Parents often want the best for their children, even if their methods are somewhat overwhelming." They walked slowly along the garden path, the autumn afternoon mild enough for a comfortable stroll. Julian spoke of his estate, of the responsibilities that came with his title, careful not to overstate his position but honest about the life he led. "I won't pretend my life is simple," he said at one point. "There are expectations that come with my title, obligations I cannot ignore. I would want you to understand that fully, before things progress further between us." I appreciate your honesty, Elena said. Though I confess I know very little about what it means to be courted by a duke. Neither did I, when I first considered it, Julian admitted with a faint laugh. I've spent most of my adult life avoiding serious courtship, much to my mother's frustration before she passed. I found most women I met were more interested in my title than in anything I actually thought or felt. And you believe I'm different? Elena asked, genuinely curious rather than seeking reassurance. I know you are, Julian said simply. You didn't know who I was when we met in that garden. You spoke to me as though I were simply a man standing alone at a gathering, not a title to be pursued. That meant more to me than you likely realize. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth entirely different from the fleeting excitement she had once felt with Nathan. This felt steadier, more grounded, as though Julian's interest in her had roots rather than the shallow soil that had allowed Nathan's affection to be so easily uprooted by her sister's attention. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path. Elena turned to find Nathan approaching, his expression conflicted as he registered Julian's presence beside her. Elena, Nathan said, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately put her on guard. I need to speak with you, alone, if possible. Julian's posture shifted slightly, though his tone remained even. Perhaps another time would be more appropriate. It's fine, Elena said, though uncertainty flickered through her. Julian, would you mind giving us a moment? Julian studied Nathan for a long moment before nodding, stepping a short distance away though remaining within sight, close enough that his presence offered Elena a quiet reassurance even as she turned to face the man who had once promised her a future that never came to pass. What do you want, Nathan? Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the discomfort of the conversation. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, an old nervous habit Elena remembered well. I've made a mistake, Elena. Marrying Grace, I mean. I don't know what I thought. But watching you these past weeks, seeing you with him, he gestured vaguely toward Julian. I realize how much I threw away. Elena felt a strange, distant sort of pity for him, though it carried none of the pain she might have expected weeks earlier. You're married now, Nathan. To my sister. Whatever regrets you have, they're yours to carry, not mine to fix. I know that, Nathan said, his voice tight with frustration. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I only needed you to know that I understand now, too late, what I lost when I chose Grace over you. That understanding comes far too late to matter, Elena said, her voice gentle but firm. I've moved past what happened between us. I would ask that you do the same, for both our sakes, and for the sake of your marriage to my sister. Nathan's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him as he registered the finality in her tone. I suppose I deserve that.
I don't say it to hurt you,
Elena said.
I say it because it's true.
And because clinging to what might have been will only make you and Grace both miserable. Nathan nodded slowly, though his eyes drifted once more toward Julian, standing patiently a short distance away. He seems like a good man. He is, Elena said simply, and found she believed it completely. Without another word, Nathan turned and walked back toward the house, his posture heavy with the weight of a regret he would now have to carry alone. Elena watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over her, as though a final chapter of her old life had quietly ended. Julian approached once Nathan had disappeared from view, his expression carefully neutral, though concern lingered in his eyes. Are you all right? I am, Elena said, and realized she meant it. He came to apologize, in his own way. I think he finally understands what he lost. And how do you feel about that? Julian asked gently. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. I feel nothing but relief that it's finally over. Whatever I felt for him has been replaced by something far steadier, something I never expected to find so soon after everything that happened. Julian's expression softened at her words, and though he said nothing further, the warmth in his gaze conveyed everything Elena needed to understand about his own feelings toward her. As the afternoon light began to fade, Julian took his leave, promising to call again soon, and to speak further with her father about his intentions. Elena stood at the edge of the garden long after his carriage had departed, watching the road until it disappeared from view, her heart fuller than it had been in months. Inside the house, Margaret pressed her for every detail of the visit, her excitement barely contained as she speculated about what a courtship with a duke might mean for the family's standing. Elena answered her mother's questions with patient brevity, saving the details that truly mattered: Julian's honesty, his steady presence, the quiet strength he had shown when Nathan interrupted their walk, for herself alone. That evening, after her mother had finally retired for the night, Elena sat with her father in the quiet of his study, a rare moment of privacy between them that she found herself grateful for. "He spoke with me again today, before he left," her father said, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "Julian, I mean. He wished to formalize his intentions properly, to court you with an understanding that marriage may follow should you both remain willing." Elena's heart quickened at the words. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him the decision was yours to make, not mine," her father said. "Though I confess, I find myself hoping you'll choose to accept him. Not for the title, Elena, though I won't pretend that doesn't matter to your mother, but because he speaks of you with a respect I never once heard from Nathan, even in the earliest days of your acquaintance with him." "I noticed that too," Elena admitted quietly. "He asks what I think. He listens when I answer. Nathan always seemed to be waiting for his turn to speak, even when he was supposedly listening to me." Her father nodded slowly. "Then trust that instinct. You've spent enough years doubting your own judgment because of how this family treated your feelings. Don't let old habits convince you to doubt this, when everything about it seems genuine." Elena reached across the space between their chairs and squeezed her father's hand, grateful for a rare moment of true understanding between them. "Thank you, Father, for saying that, and for trusting me to decide for myself." "You've always deserved that trust," he replied. "I'm only sorry it took me this long to show it properly." The following days brought a steady rhythm of correspondence between Elena and Julian, interspersed with 2 more visits that grew increasingly comfortable, as Margaret's initial excitement settled into something closer to genuine warmth, though her tendency to hover never entirely disappeared. Elena found herself looking forward to each letter, each visit, with an anticipation she had never truly felt with Nathan, whose attention had always carried an undercurrent of uncertainty she hadn't recognized until it was gone. During one visit, as they walked together through the orchard behind the Marsh estate, Julian spoke more openly than he had before about his own family history, about the mother he had lost several years earlier, and the weight of responsibility that had fallen to him afterward, as the eldest son. "I sometimes wonder if I've forgotten how to simply enjoy someone's company," he admitted, without calculating what obligations might follow. "My mother used to say I approached everything as though it were a matter of state, even simple pleasures. And do you feel that way now?" Elena asked, curious despite the personal nature of the question. Julian considered this carefully before answering. "No. With you, I find I don't think of obligation at all. I simply want to know more about what makes you laugh, what troubles keep you awake at night, what you dream of when you allow yourself to dream freely. It's rather freeing, actually, to want something purely for its own sake rather than for what it might secure." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and unbidden. "That's the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." "Then I intend to keep saying kind things," Julian replied, "for as long as you'll let me." Their bond deepened with each visit, each letter, each quiet conversation exchanged beneath the orchard trees, or in the drawing room under Margaret's watchful but increasingly approving eye. Elena felt herself changing, growing more confident, more willing to speak her mind, as though Julian's steady regard had given her permission to become fully herself, after years of shrinking to accommodate her mother's preferences and her sister's demands. She did not yet know that word of Julian's continued interest would soon reach Grace, now settled into her new marriage but far from content, and that her sister's jealousy, already stirred at the wedding, would soon curdle into something far more dangerous than sharp words exchanged in a garden. Grace's new household, situated only a short carriage ride from her family home, had not brought her the contentment she expected. Nathan spent long hours away on matters he claimed were business-related, returning each evening with a distracted air that Grace found increasingly difficult to ignore. She had imagined marriage would feel like a constant celebration, a continuation of the attention she had enjoyed during their courtship, but instead she found herself alone more often than not, filling her days with small tasks that failed to satisfy the restlessness building inside her. It was during one of these idle afternoons that Grace received a visit from a cousin who had recently returned from town, full of news and gossip that spread through the family circles like wildfire. "You'll never believe what everyone is saying about your sister," the cousin, a young woman named Eleanor Whitby, said as she settled into the drawing room, with obvious relish for the news she carried. "Elena is being courted by Duke Julian Ashford, openly, with her father's blessing. People say he intends to propose before winter arrives." Grace's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. "Elena, courted by a duke? It's the talk of the entire county," Eleanor continued, oblivious to the way Grace's expression had darkened. "Everyone remembers how quiet and overlooked she always seemed, and now here she is, catching the attention of one of the most sought-after men in the region. Quite the turn of fortune, wouldn't you say? Grace forced a smile, though it felt brittle even to her. How wonderful for her. But once Eleanor departed, the smile fell away entirely, replaced by something sharper, something that had been quietly building since the moment Elena had danced with Julian at her own wedding. Grace had spent her entire life ensuring she remained the center of attention, the favored daughter, the one whose choices dictated the family's fortunes. The idea that Elena, quiet and forgettable Elena, might surpass her in status was intolerable. She thought back to the wedding, to the whispers she had overheard among guests admiring the Duke's evident interest in her sister, to Nathan's own strange defense of Elena when Grace had complained about the dance. Something cold settled in her chest, a determination she recognized from childhood, whenever she had set her mind on taking something that belonged, or seemed destined to belong, to someone else. That evening, when Nathan returned home later than usual, Grace confronted him with barely contained frustration. "Did you know about Elena and the Duke?" she demanded before he had even removed his coat. Nathan's expression flickered with something Grace couldn't quite read. "I've heard the rumors, yes. And you didn't think to tell me?" "I didn't think it was any of our concern," Nathan said carefully, though something in his tone suggested he was choosing his words with unusual caution. "Not our concern," Grace repeated, her voice rising. "She's my sister, marrying into a dukedom while I'm stuck here waiting for you to come home from whatever business keeps you away every evening. Of course it's my concern." Nathan sighed heavily, rubbing a hand across his face in a gesture of exhaustion Grace had grown increasingly familiar with over their short marriage. "What would you have me do, Grace? I can't control who courts your sister." "I don't want you to control it," Grace said. "I want you to help me stop it." Nathan's eyes widened with surprise. "Stop it? Grace, that's absurd. Elena has done nothing wrong by accepting a duke's attention. If anything, given everything that happened between the three of us, she deserves whatever happiness she's found." Grace's face flushed with anger at the implication buried in his words. "So you admit you still care what happens to her?" "I admit I feel guilty for the pain we caused her," Nathan said carefully. "That's different from caring in the way you're suggesting, and you know it." The argument continued long into the evening, each accusation sharper than the last, until Grace finally retreated to her room, her mind churning with resentment she could not fully articulate even to herself. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling much as Elena once had, though her thoughts carried none of her sister's sorrow, only a growing determination to reclaim the position she felt entitled to. Over the following days, Grace began quietly gathering information about Julian's family, his social circle, anyone who might be susceptible to doubt about Elena's suitability as a future duchess. She visited old acquaintances under the guise of social calls, steering conversations toward Elena whenever possible, planting small seeds of doubt disguised as innocent observations. "Elena has always been rather withdrawn," she mentioned to one particularly well-connected acquaintance during afternoon tea. "I do worry sometimes that she isn't quite suited to the demands of society at the highest levels. She prefers solitude to social gatherings, you understand." "Surely a duchess needs to be comfortable in society," her acquaintance mused, exactly as Grace had hoped. "I only mention it out of concern for her happiness," Grace added, feigning reluctance even as satisfaction bloomed inside her at the seeds she had successfully planted. She continued this pattern over the following weeks, careful never to speak outright criticism of her sister but always framing her comments in ways designed to raise questions in the minds of those who might repeat them to Julian's circle. She spoke of Elena's delicate temperament, her reluctance to engage fully with society, her tendency toward melancholy, that Grace suggested, without ever stating directly, might make her unsuited to the pressures of a ducal household. The rumors began slowly at first. Whispered comments passed between acquaintances who had no reason to doubt Grace's sisterly concern. But rumors, once released, take on a life of their own, and within a fortnight, versions of Grace's careful insinuations had reached ears far beyond her intended audience. Henry Ashford was the first to notice the shift in tone among certain social circles regarding Elena. He mentioned it to Julian one evening, carefully choosing his words as they sat together in the study of the Ashford estate. "There's talk circulating about Miss Marsh," Henry said, watching his brother's reaction closely. "Nothing outright scandalous, but concerning nonetheless. People questioning her temperament, her suitability for a position such as Duchess." Julian's expression darkened immediately. "What sort of talk?" "Suggestions that she's prone to melancholy, that she withdraws from society more than would be expected of someone in her position. I traced some of it back to conversations Grace Cole has been having around town." Julian's jaw tightened at the mention of Grace's name. Her own sister? It would seem so, Henry confirmed. Whether out of jealousy or some other motive, I cannot say for certain, but the pattern is difficult to ignore once you begin looking for it. Julian sat in troubled silence for a long moment, processing this information alongside everything he had come to know of Elena through their weeks of courtship. Nothing in her behavior, her conversation, or her character suggested any truth to the rumors circulating about her. I won't allow baseless gossip to poison what's been built between us, Julian said finally, his voice firm with resolve. But I need to understand the source clearly before I address it. Over the following days, Julian made careful inquiries of his own, speaking discreetly with several of the acquaintances who had repeated the rumors, tracing each conversation back methodically until the pattern Henry had identified became undeniable. Every thread led back, in some fashion, to conversations Grace had initiated, comments she had planted with the precision of someone who understood exactly how gossip spread and multiplied. He decided to confront her directly rather than allow the situation to fester further, arranging a visit to Nathan and Grace's household under the pretense of a social call, though his true purpose was far more direct. Grace received him with visible surprise, quickly masked by her usual practiced pleasantness. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor. Nathan is away on business, I'm afraid, but please, come in." "I've actually come to speak with you," Julian said, his tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of seriousness that immediately put Grace on alert. They settled in the drawing room, a servant bringing tea that neither of them touched as Julian regarded Grace with a steady, assessing gaze. "I've become aware of certain rumors circulating about Elena," he said without preamble, watching Grace's reaction carefully. "Rumors that seem to trace back to conversations you've had with various acquaintances." Grace's composure flickered, though she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you mean. I've only ever expressed concern for my sister's happiness." "Have you?" Julian asked, his tone remaining even despite the sharpness beneath his words. "Because from where I sit, it appears you've been carefully constructing a narrative designed to undermine her character, spreading it through conversations calculated to reach my family's ears without your fingerprints being obvious." Grace's face paled slightly, though she attempted to maintain her composure. "I don't understand why you would accuse me of something so cruel. She's my sister." "She's the sister whose fiancé you married," Julian said, his voice hardening. "The sister whose happiness you seem determined to sabotage, first through Nathan and now through these rumors. I understand jealousy can drive people to unfortunate actions, Mrs. Cole, but I won't allow it to poison my understanding of the woman I intend to marry." The word marry hung in the air between them, and Grace's expression shifted from defensive to something closer to genuine alarm as the full weight of the situation settled over her. "You intend to propose?" she asked, her voice smaller than Julian had ever heard it. "I did, before these rumors began circulating," Julian confirmed. "Your interference has not changed that intention, only delayed the timing while I addressed the damage you attempted to cause." Grace sat in stunned silence, her carefully constructed schemes unraveling before her with devastating clarity. "I never meant—" "I think you meant precisely what you did," Julian interrupted, his tone final. "I won't pretend to understand what drives someone to undermine their own sister's happiness so deliberately, but I will tell you this clearly. Any further attempts to interfere with my relationship with Elena will not be tolerated. I have connections and resources far beyond what you might imagine, and I will not hesitate to use them to protect her reputation, should you continue down this path." The threat, delivered calmly but with unmistakable resolve, left Grace with nothing to say. She watched Julian rise from his seat, his expression carrying none of the warmth he had shown during their first meeting weeks earlier, only cold determination. "I trust we understand each other," he said, and departed without waiting for her response. Grace remained in the drawing room long after he had gone, her mind reeling with the realization that her efforts had not only failed but had potentially damaged her own standing rather than Elena's. She thought of Nathan's earlier warning, of the quiet way he had begun avoiding conversations about her sister, and wondered, for the first time, if her jealousy had cost her more than she was prepared to admit. Elena learned of the confrontation 2 days later, when Julian visited and explained everything with careful honesty, unwilling to keep the truth from her despite the pain it might cause. "I'm sorry you had to learn this way," Julian said gently, watching her process the revelation of her sister's betrayal. "I debated whether to tell you at all, but I couldn't bear the thought of keeping something so significant hidden." Elena sat quietly for a long moment, feelings of hurt and anger warring within her, though beneath them she found something closer to resigned understanding. "I suppose I shouldn't be entirely surprised. Grace has never handled watching others succeed particularly well." "You're taking this remarkably calmly," Julian observed. I've had years of practice absorbing my sister's jealousy, Elena said, a tired smile touching her lips. Though I confess, this particular betrayal cuts deeper than most. I hadn't expected her to actively work against my happiness, not after everything with Nathan. Julian reached for her hand, offering silent comfort as she processed the weight of her sister's actions. Whatever she attempted, it changed nothing about my feelings for you. If anything, it only confirmed how much I want to protect what we've built together. Elena squeezed his hand gratefully, drawing strength from his steady presence as she had come to rely on so often these past weeks. Thank you for telling me the truth, even when it would have been easier not to. I intend to always tell you the truth, Julian said firmly. Whatever comes, you deserve nothing less. As the afternoon light faded outside the window, Elena found herself reflecting on how far she had come since the night of Grace's engagement announcement, when she had believed her chance at happiness had been stolen from her entirely. Now, sitting beside a man who had defended her honor without hesitation, who had chosen honesty over comfortable silence, she felt something settle within her, a quiet certainty that whatever challenges remained ahead, she would face them from a position of strength, rather than the fragile vulnerability that had once defined her. Meanwhile, Grace's household grew increasingly strained in the days following Julian's visit. Nathan returned home to find his wife unusually subdued, her earlier sharpness replaced by a brooding silence that concerned him more than her usual complaints. "What's troubling you?" he finally asked one evening, watching her push food around her plate without eating. "Nothing you'd understand," Grace muttered, though the words carried less bite than usual. Nathan set down his fork, studying her with a mixture of frustration and something almost like concern. "Try me." Grace hesitated, weighing whether to admit the truth of what she had done, before finally relenting under the weight of her own guilt. "I may have said some things about Elena, to people around town, things that weren't entirely fair." Nathan's expression hardened immediately. "What kind of things?" "Suggestions about her temperament, her suitability for society." Grace's voice grew smaller as she spoke, the confidence that usually armored her words entirely absent. "The Duke found out. He came here and confronted me directly. You tried to sabotage her happiness," Nathan said slowly, understanding dawning across his features. "After everything we already took from her." "I didn't think of it that way," Grace protested weakly. "Then how did you think of it?" Nathan demanded, his own guilt over his treatment of Elena rising to the surface in his anger toward his wife. "Grace, we ruined 3 years of her life. The least we could do now is let her find happiness elsewhere without actively working against it." Grace had no answer for him, and the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, broken only by the quiet sounds of the household settling around them for the evening. It was the first time since their wedding that Nathan had looked at her with something other than affection, and the realization settled heavily in Grace's chest, a consequence she had not anticipated when she began her campaign of careful rumors weeks earlier. Elena, unaware of the full extent of the tension now brewing in her sister's household, spent the following days in quiet anticipation of Julian's promised return. She busied herself with small tasks around the house, though her thoughts constantly drifted to their last conversation, to the steady warmth in his eyes when he had promised to always tell her the truth. Her mother, having learned only partial details of the rumor campaign through servants' gossip that inevitably found its way into every corner of local society, approached Elena one afternoon with unusual gentleness. "I heard whispers that Grace may have spoken unkindly about you to others," Margaret said carefully, clearly uncertain how to broach the subject. "Is there truth to this?" Elena considered how much to reveal, uncertain whether her mother would side with her or find some way to excuse Grace's behavior, as she so often had in the past. Julian confirmed it himself. "She's been suggesting to people that I'm unsuited for society, that my temperament makes me a poor choice for someone of his standing." Margaret's face flushed with an emotion Elena rarely saw from her, genuine anger directed at Grace rather than at Elena herself. "That girl has always taken more than her fair share, but this is beyond anything I expected, even from her." "You're not defending her?" Elena asked, genuinely surprised. "Should I be?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of shame. "I've spent years favoring Grace without fully understanding the cost to you, Elena. I see that more clearly now than I ever have before. This latest cruelty of hers has made that impossible to ignore any longer." It was, Elena realized, the closest her mother had ever come to admitting fault in how she had raised and treated her daughters differently. She said nothing further on the matter, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected shift, but found herself grateful nonetheless for the small acknowledgement, however overdue it might have been. She did not yet know that Julian's next visit would bring the question she had been quietly hoping for since their very first conversation in the garden, nor how completely her life was about to transform in the days that followed. The morning Julian arrived unannounced, Elena knew immediately that something had shifted. He stood in the entrance hall with an intensity in his expression she hadn't seen before, though warmth softened every line of his face when his eyes found hers. "I hope you'll forgive the lack of notice," he said, "but I found I couldn't wait another day." "Wait for what?" Elena asked, though something in her chest had already begun to race with anticipation. "Walk with me," Julian said, extending his hand. Elena took it without hesitation, allowing him to lead her out through the garden and toward the orchard where they had spent so many quiet afternoons over the past weeks, the trees now bare with the approach of winter but no less beautiful for their starkness against the pale morning sky. Julian stopped beneath the largest apple tree, the same one where he had first spoken to her so openly about his family, his obligations, his hopes for something real beyond the calculations of title and duty. He turned to face her fully, and Elena noticed, for the first time, a slight tremor in his usually steady composure. "Elena," he began, "when we met that night in the garden, I was a man who had spent years believing genuine connection was beyond my reach, that my title would always stand between me and anyone who might truly know me. You changed that within the span of a single conversation, before you even knew who I was." Elena's eyes began to sting with unexpected tears as he continued. "Since then, every moment I've spent in your company has confirmed what I suspected that first night, that you are exactly the kind of person I want beside me, not despite the challenges we might face, but because I know you would face them with honesty and strength I've rarely encountered in anyone else." He knelt then, and Elena's breath caught entirely as understanding settled over her. "You were never the sister who was overlooked," Julian said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You are the one worth waiting for, the one I choose above any expectation placed on me by title or tradition. Elena Marsh, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, my Duchess, my partner in everything that lies ahead?" Elena's tears fell freely now, though they carried none of the sorrow that had marked so many of her tears in recent months. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." Julian rose and pulled her into an embrace, and for a long moment, they simply stood together beneath the bare branches of the orchard, the cold morning air forgotten entirely in the warmth of the promise they had just exchanged. News of the engagement spread through the county with remarkable speed, carrying an entirely different quality than the whispers Grace had once tried to plant. Where those rumors had been quiet and calculated, this news arrived with genuine celebration, families eager to offer congratulations to a match that seemed, to everyone who had witnessed Elena and Julian together, entirely deserved. Margaret, upon hearing the news, wept openly, a mixture of pride and lingering guilt evident in her tears, as she embraced her eldest daughter for what felt like the first time in years, with true, uncomplicated warmth. "I am so proud of you," she said, holding Elena at arm's length to study her face. "And so very sorry for every moment I failed to see how deserving you were of happiness." "You're seeing it now, Mother," Elena said gently. "That's what matters." Her father's reaction carried its own quiet emotion, a firm embrace and words spoken with unusual openness. "Julian is a fortunate man, Elena. I only hope he knows exactly how fortunate." "He knows," Elena said with certainty, thinking of the countless small ways Julian had shown her, since their very first conversation, that he understood precisely what he had found in her. The wedding preparations that followed carried none of the frantic, joyless energy that had defined Grace's own wedding months earlier. Elena found herself genuinely engaged in every decision, choosing flowers she loved rather than colors meant to please someone else, selecting a gown that reflected her own taste rather than her mother's preferences. Julian involved himself in the preparations as much as his responsibilities allowed, insisting on being consulted about details large and small, a partnership that felt entirely different from the passive role Elena had once played in her sister's celebration. Grace's presence during this period remained notably subdued. The confrontation with Julian, combined with Nathan's continued disappointment in her actions, had left her chastened in a way Elena had never witnessed from her sister before. When Grace finally approached Elena directly, several weeks before the wedding, her demeanor carried none of its usual sharp confidence. "I owe you an apology," Grace said, finding Elena alone in the garden one afternoon, "for everything, not just the rumors, though those were unforgivable enough, but for Nathan too. For 3 years of watching you build something and deciding I wanted it more than I cared about your feelings." Elena studied her sister carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the words. What's brought this on? Watching you find real happiness, I suppose, Grace admitted, her voice smaller than Elena had ever heard it. It's made me realize how empty my own choices were. Nathan and we're not happy, Elena. I think in some way, I always knew we wouldn't be, but I wanted what you had regardless. And now? Elena asked. Now I understand that taking something never actually gives you what you were truly missing, Grace said. I'm sorry it took me so long, and so much damage, to understand that. Elena considered her sister's words for a long moment, weighing years of hurt against the genuine remorse she saw reflected in Grace's expression. I appreciate you saying this, Grace. I won't pretend the wounds heal instantly, but I don't wish to carry this anger forward into my new life either. Perhaps, in time, we can find our way back to something resembling the sisters we were before all of this happened. Grace's eyes filled with tears at the offer of reconciliation, however cautious. That's more than I deserve. Perhaps, Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips. But I've decided I'd rather build something new than carry old resentments into my marriage. Julian has taught me that much, at least. The sisters embraced then, tentatively at first, before Grace's tears fell freely against Elena's shoulder, years of complicated history beginning, slowly, to find some measure of resolution. The wedding day arrived with a clarity and brightness that felt like a direct contrast to the cold autumn morning of Grace's own ceremony months earlier. Elena stood before her mirror in a gown of pale ivory, her hair arranged simply but elegantly, and found none of the hollow performance that had marked her presence at her sister's wedding. Every emotion she felt today was entirely her own: joy, anticipation, a quiet certainty that she was walking toward exactly the life she was meant to have. The ceremony took place in the grand chapel on the Ashford estate, filled with guests from both families and the wider social circles that had watched this courtship unfold with genuine interest and approval. Elena walked down the aisle on her father's arm, catching sight of Julian waiting for her at the altar, his expression carrying an emotion so raw and genuine that her own composure nearly broke before she even reached him. You look absolutely radiant, he whispered as she took her place beside him. I feel it, Elena replied softly, and meant every word. The vows they exchanged carried none of the practiced formality Elena remembered from Grace's wedding. Julian's voice, when he spoke his promises, carried a depth of sincerity that brought tears to the eyes of guests throughout the chapel, and Elena's own voice, though it trembled slightly with emotion, remained steady with certainty as she promised herself to the man who had chosen her without hesitation or condition. When the ceremony concluded and they were announced to the gathered guests as Duke and Duchess Ashford, Elena felt the full weight of her transformation settle over her. Not the transformation of title or status, though those mattered in their own way, but the deeper transformation of finally being seen, valued, and chosen entirely for who she was. The reception that followed carried a joy that felt entirely genuine, guests celebrating a union that everyone present seemed to recognize as rare and deserved. Margaret moved through the crowd with unrestrained pride, her earlier favoritism toward Grace entirely forgotten in her evident delight at Elena's new position. Her father remained close throughout the celebration, occasionally catching Elena's eye with a small, proud smile that spoke volumes without need for words. Even Grace, present with Nathan at her side, seemed to find genuine happiness in witnessing her sister's celebration, her earlier jealousy replaced by something closer to admiration, as she watched Elena move through the reception with confidence and grace that had blossomed fully since the difficult days following her broken engagement to Nathan. As the evening progressed, Julian found a quiet moment to pull Elena aside, away from the noise and celebration, to a private balcony overlooking the estate's expansive gardens now illuminated by lanterns strung carefully among the trees. Do you remember what you told me, that first night in the garden? Julian asked, his arm wrapped comfortably around her waist as they looked out over the peaceful scene below. I told you many things that night, Elena said, smiling up at him. You said gardens ask less of you than ballrooms, Julian reminded her, that no one expected you to dance or laugh at the right moments. I remember, Elena said softly. I hope, from this day forward, that changes, Julian said, his voice carrying quiet sincerity. Not because anyone will demand performance from you, but because I hope you'll find, in our life together, that laughter and dancing come naturally, without pretense or obligation. Elena felt tears gather in her eyes once more, though these carried only joy. With you, they already have. They stood together on the balcony for a long while, watching the celebration continue below them. Two people who had each, in their own way, learned to trust again after disappointment and loss had taught them caution. Elena thought of the 3 years she had spent loving a man who ultimately chose comfort and familiarity over depth, of the humiliation of watching her sister claim what she believed was hers, of the long, painful weeks that had followed. And she thought too of the quiet garden where an unexpected conversation had planted the seeds of something far more lasting and true than anything she had known before. She had once believed that love meant waiting patiently for someone to finally choose you, enduring whatever indignities came before that choice was made. Julian had taught her something different entirely, that real love arrived not through patient endurance of mistreatment, but through mutual recognition, honesty, and the steady, unwavering choice to see and value another person exactly as they were. As the first guests began departing and the night grew late, Julian led Elena back into the celebration, where they danced together beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting months earlier. Elena rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, and allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe in the happiness she had once feared was never meant to be hers. The girl who had once stood humiliated at her sister's engagement announcement, who had smiled through wedding preparations for a marriage that should have been her own, who had absorbed years of being overlooked in favor of a sister who took whatever she wanted without consequence, had become a duchess, not through luck or circumstance, but through her own quiet strength and the recognition of a man who saw her worth from the very first conversation. Later that evening, as the celebration wound toward its close and guests began making their farewells, Henry approached Elena with a warm smile, offering his own congratulations with the easy affection of a brother welcoming a new sister into the family. "I confess I knew this would happen from the moment I saw the two of you together in that garden," he said. "Julian hasn't stopped speaking of you since that first night. I've never seen my brother so thoroughly captivated." "I'm grateful you brought him to that gathering," Elena said, smiling at the memory. "I understand it took some convincing on your part." "The best decision I ever made," Henry replied with a laugh. "Watch over him well. He's better with grand gestures than small, everyday kindnesses, though I suspect you already know that about him." "I know he tries," Elena said fondly, glancing toward where Julian stood speaking with her father, "and that matters more than perfection ever could." As the last of the guests departed and the estate grew quiet around them, Julian and Elena found themselves alone once more in the grand hall, the remnants of celebration still scattered around them, flowers slightly wilted from the long day, candles burned low in their holders, the quiet hush that follows any great gathering once its energy has finally dispersed. "Regrets?" Julian asked, taking her hand as they stood together amid the quiet aftermath. "None," Elena said immediately. "Though I confess, I keep waiting to wake and discover this was simply a very vivid dream." "If it is, then I share it entirely," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, "though I intend to prove its reality to you every day for the rest of our lives together, until the doubt disappears entirely." They walked together through the quiet halls of what was now Elena's home as well, Julian pointing out details she had not noticed during her earlier visits, a portrait of his mother that hung in a small alcove near the library, a window seat where he had spent countless childhood hours reading, a garden path that led to a small pond he promised to show her properly once the weather turned milder. "There's so much of your life I still don't know," Elena said, marveling at the scope of the home that now belonged to her as much as to him. "We have years ahead to discover it together," Julian replied. "I find I'm rather looking forward to that, more than I ever imagined possible." They paused near a window overlooking the gardens, now dark except for a few lanterns still burning near the paths where guests had walked earlier that evening. Elena leaned against Julian's shoulder, feeling a contentment so complete it almost frightened her, given how thoroughly her life had been upended by disappointment only months before. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing something in me worth pursuing, even when I couldn't yet see it in myself." "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me," Julian replied, wrapping his arm more securely around her. "That took courage, after everything you'd endured." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the last lanterns flicker in the darkened gardens below, two people who had each found, unexpectedly and against considerable odds, exactly the partnership they had quietly hoped existed somewhere in the world for them. Elena thought of the frightened, humiliated woman who had fled to her bedroom the night of Grace's engagement announcement, unable to imagine any future beyond her grief, and felt a profound gratitude for the winding path that had led her here instead, to this quiet moment of peace beside a man who had chosen her completely. Elena Ashford, no longer Elena Marsh, closed her eyes and let herself simply feel the joy of the moment, certain, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them from a place of genuine love and partnership, exactly as she deserved. A year passed, and the Ashford estate had settled into a rhythm of quiet happiness that Elena still sometimes marveled at, waking each morning beside Julian, and finding it difficult to believe this had become her ordinary life, rather than some distant dream she once feared would never arrive. Winter had given way to spring, and spring to the warmth of summer, each season bringing new discoveries about married life, about the particular joys and small adjustments that came with building a shared existence with another person. Julian had proven, as Henry predicted, better suited to grand gestures than tiny daily kindnesses, though he had learned, gradually and with visible effort, to notice the small things that mattered to Elena, remembering her preference for tea over coffee in the mornings, learning which books brought her comfort on difficult days, understanding when she needed quiet solitude rather than conversation. Elena, in turn, had grown into her role as Duchess with a confidence that surprised even her. Where she had once shrunk from attention, preferring the quiet corners of any gathering, she found herself now capable of commanding a room when necessary, of advocating for causes she cared about with the same steady conviction Julian had shown when confronting Grace's rumors months earlier. She established a small charitable fund dedicated to supporting young women without family resources, a project born directly from her own experience of feeling overlooked and undervalued within her own household. "You've built something remarkable," Julian said one afternoon, watching Elena review applications for the fund's latest round of support at the desk in her private study, a room he had insisted on creating for her shortly after their wedding, understanding her need for space entirely her own. "I only wanted to make sure other women in difficult circumstances had somewhere to turn," Elena said, looking up from her papers with a smile. "Somewhere I wish I'd had, during the worst of everything with Nathan and Grace." Speaking of her sister no longer carried the sharp sting it once had. In the months following the wedding, Grace had made genuine efforts to rebuild their relationship, small gestures of kindness and honesty that had gradually softened the distance between them. Her marriage to Nathan remained strained, the two of them navigating a partnership built on shallow foundations that had never quite deepened into anything more substantial. But Grace herself had changed in ways that surprised everyone who had known her before. She visited Elena and Julian regularly now, often alone, finding in these visits a genuine friendship with her sister that had never existed during their childhood, when rivalry and their mother's favoritism had always stood between them. Elena found herself, cautiously but genuinely, enjoying these visits, watching her sister engage with real curiosity in conversations about the charitable fund, about the books Elena read, about the small details of daily life at the Ashford estate. "I never properly thanked you," Grace said during one such visit, the two sisters walking together through the same orchard where Julian had once proposed, "for forgiving me, after everything I did." "I didn't forgive you because you deserved it immediately," Elena said honestly. "I forgave you because carrying that anger would have poisoned the happiness I'd finally found. I wanted a life built on something better than resentment." "I'm trying to build something better too," Grace admitted. "Though I confess, Nathan and I don't know that we'll ever have what you and Julian share. I think I understood, even before we married, that we weren't quite right for each other, but I was too proud to admit it once I'd already claimed him from you." Elena studied her sister's face, seeing genuine sadness there rather than the sharp calculation she remembered from years past. "I'm sorry, Grace, truly. Whatever happened between us, I never wished unhappiness on you." "I know that now," Grace said. "It's taken me far too long to understand who you really are. Beneath everything I convinced myself justified how I treated you." Their relationship would never be entirely uncomplicated, Elena understood. The wounds of years past too deep to disappear completely. But something genuine had grown between them nonetheless, a fragile but real connection built on honesty rather than the careful performances that had once defined their family's interactions. Margaret, too, had changed considerably since the wedding, her earlier favoritism toward Grace replaced by a more balanced affection for both daughters, though the transformation had come with its own quiet grief as she recognized how many years she had spent overlooking Elena's needs in favor of her more demanding younger daughter. She visited often, finding particular joy in her role as grandmother when Elena and Julian's first child arrived that spring, a daughter they named Charlotte, after the kind stranger Elena had met at the very gathering where her new life had begun. "She has your eyes," Margaret said, holding her granddaughter with careful tenderness during one of her frequent visits. "And I suspect, given her father, she'll have his quiet strength as well." "I hope she has both our stubbornness," Julian said with a laugh, watching his daughter's small fist close around Elena's finger with surprising determination. "She'll need it, growing up in this family." Elena watched her husband with their daughter, feeling a contentment so complete it sometimes brought unexpected tears to her eyes, remembering how impossible this happiness had once seemed during the darkest weeks following Grace's engagement announcement. She thought often of that frightened young woman who had fled to her bedroom, certain her chance at love had been permanently stolen from her, and felt profound gratitude that life had proven far more generous than she once believed possible. Henry remained a constant presence in their lives, his easy humor and genuine affection for Elena never wavering since that first night in the garden when he had teased his brother for finding excellent company outside the noise of the gathering hall. He had married the following year, a match Julian and Elena had happily encouraged, and their combined families often gathered for dinners that filled the Ashford estate with laughter and warmth that Elena still sometimes marveled at, given how quiet and lonely her own childhood home had often felt. Nathan, for his part, remained a distant figure in Elena's life, their paths crossing occasionally at family gatherings involving Grace but never carrying the weight or tension that had once defined their interactions. He seemed, over time, to settle into a quiet acceptance of the choices that had shaped his life, treating Elena with a respectful distance that suited them both far better than any attempt at friendship might have. On the evening of Charlotte's first birthday, the Ashford estate filled once more with family and friends, celebrating the small milestones that had come to define Elena's new life. Not grand titles or social standing, though those remained part of her world, but the quieter joys of watching her daughter take her first unsteady steps across the drawing room floor, of sharing knowing glances with Julian across a crowded room, the way they once had at that very first gathering years before. "Do you ever think about that night?" Julian asked later, as they stood together on the same balcony where they had once looked out over their wedding celebration, now watching the sunset paint the gardens in shades of gold and amber. "The one where we met?" "Constantly," Elena admitted, leaning into his familiar embrace. "I think about how easily I might have stayed inside that hall instead of stepping onto the terrace. How different everything might have been." "I like to think we would have found each other regardless," Julian said, "though I'm grateful we didn't have to test that theory." Elena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light of day faded into evening. "I used to believe my story had ended the night Nathan chose Grace instead of me. I thought everything good in my life had already happened and passed me by." "And now?" Julian asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Now I understand that ending was simply the beginning of something far better than anything I could have imagined for myself," Elena said. "I spent 3 years loving someone who never truly saw me, waiting for a future that was never meant to be mine. It took losing that future entirely to find the one that actually belonged to me." Julian pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and together they watched the stars begin to emerge above the gardens, the same gardens where their story had first begun, now filled with the quiet, steady happiness of a life built not on desperate hope or careful performance, but on genuine partnership, honesty, and love freely given and freely received. Inside, their daughter's laughter rang out as she took another wobbling step toward her grandmother's waiting arms, and Elena felt, as she often did in these quiet moments, an overwhelming gratitude for the winding, difficult path that had led her here, to this home, this family, this love she had once feared would never be hers. Later that night, after the guests had departed and Charlotte had finally settled into sleep, Elena sat with Julian in the quiet of their private sitting room, a fire burning low in the hearth against the cool evening air. "I've been thinking about starting a second charitable venture," Elena said, tucking her feet beneath her as she settled into the chair beside his. "Something focused on supporting young women whose families have arranged marriages that serve everyone's interests but their own. I know it's not quite the same as what happened between Grace and me, but the underlying unfairness feels similar." Julian set aside the letter he had been reading, giving her his full attention in the way she had come to treasure over their years together. "Tell me more." Elena spoke at length about her vision, about the resources such a venture might require, about the women she hoped to reach who might otherwise feel as trapped and voiceless as she once had. Julian listened with genuine interest, offering suggestions born from his own understanding of estate management and charitable structures, the two of them building the framework of a new project together with the same easy partnership that had come to define every aspect of their marriage. "You would have made a formidable Duchess even without me," Julian said eventually, watching her with open admiration. "I sometimes wonder what path your life might have taken if we'd never met that night." "I don't like to imagine it," Elena admitted. "Though I suspect I would have found my way to some version of contentment eventually. I was already learning to survive my family's expectations before you arrived, but I'm endlessly grateful I didn't have to find that contentment alone." "Nor I," Julian said quietly. I spent so many years believing partnership meant compromise, meant settling for companionship without true understanding. You taught me that real partnership means finding someone who makes you more entirely yourself, not less. They sat together for a long while longer, the fire slowly burning down as they talked through plans for the coming year, for Charlotte's future, for the charitable work that had become such a meaningful part of Elena's identity beyond her title. Outside, the estate grounds settled into the particular stillness of late evening. The gardens where their story had begun now quiet beneath a sky full of stars, holding the same steady promise they had offered on that very first night, when two strangers, each carrying their own quiet burdens, had found unexpected comfort in each other's company. Elena thought, as she often did in these peaceful moments, of how completely her life had transformed since that painful evening, when she had watched Nathan take her sister's hand at the family dinner table. She thought of the pain she had carried through those difficult weeks, the humiliation of smiling through wedding preparations for a marriage that should have been hers, the desperate hope she had barely allowed herself to feel when Julian's first letter arrived. None of that pain had disappeared entirely, she understood now. It remained part of her story, part of what had shaped her into the woman capable of building the life she now lived, but it no longer defined her, no longer held power over her happiness or her sense of self-worth. She had learned, through loss and unexpected grace, that being overlooked by one person did not mean being unworthy of being truly seen by another. She was no longer the overlooked sister, no longer the woman left waiting while others claimed the futures she believed belonged to her. She was Elena Ashford, wife, mother, and Duchess, standing exactly where she was always meant to be, beside the man who had chosen her completely, without hesitation or condition, from the very first night they met beneath a quiet, star-filled sky.